Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Marquette University Law School, the virtual Lubar Center. I'm Mike Gousha, and this is On the Issues. Today, we're talking about efforts to increase police accountability. This is a conversation that really became front and center about a year ago with the death of George Floyd, the police incident involving George Floyd, and then, of course, took on some new importance here in Wisconsin when you had the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. As some of you know in the audience who are watching today, several weeks ago, the law school put on a conference looking at possible changes to policing and police accountability. We heard from community members, we heard from law enforcement officials, we heard from defense attorneys and prosecutors, and the goal of that was to talk about whether or not there's common ground for police reform and for increased police accountability. Today, we're focusing on what's happening at the state level, and we're talking with the co-chairs of the Assembly Speaker's Task Force on Racial Disparities. Representative Shelia Stubbs of Madison, the Democrat, is with us, and Representative Jim Steineke of R-Kaukauna, the Republican, is with us. And we should say that Representative Steineke is also the Assembly Majority Leader. So thanks to both of you for being with us today.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Mike.
So about a month ago, your task force released a series of recommendations, 17 or 18 recommendations on policing. And we will talk about some of those in greater detail in a moment. But you also have the governor who has his ideas of what police reform should look like. You have some of your fellow lawmakers who've introduced legislation that they think should be adopted. The question I want to begin with for each of you, and I'll start with Representative Stubbs, is a pretty simple one. How confident are you at the end of the day that there will be meaningful, significant change to Wisconsin law that will increase police accountability? Representative Stubbs.
Yes, again, thank you, Michael, for this really important interview. You know, I'll be very direct with you. I am extremely confident because the process was a fair process that included the makeup of community leaders, faith-based leaders, and law enforcement experts. We spent 7 months taking a deep dive into every policy, looking at every piece of legislation that had been introduced at the state level. We looked at other states' legislation, but I think because the process was inclusive, and the process was a process in that I really feel that all members were given an opportunity to voice their opinions. So we did not walk in that room being political. We walked in that room being the best stewards of our districts and the best representatives of our community or law enforcement agencies. So I think it's a really great process. And I hope that we are able to get 18 bills passed in law by Governor Evers.
Representative Steineke, your take on it. How do you feel this has gone? And do you share Representative Stubbs' optimism that there will be meaningful change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think initially, before we began this process, I think everybody was, a little hesitant to proclaim how big of a success this may be, just because we hadn't really tried it this way before. We hadn't really sat down and created a task force with one Republican and one Democrat, and then filled out the remainder of the task force with community members. And law enforcement and educators and healthcare professionals and people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. So initially, we didn't know what to expect, but thankfully, I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Representative Stubbs for agreeing to be part of this. I asked her specifically because I know where she's coming from. She's not a deeply political person. She's there for the right reasons, wants to get things accomplished. And that's really the kind of partnership we needed, especially on the law enforcement side of this task force, in order to come to consensus around some very difficult issues. And that was the key word during this whole process, Mike, was consensus. Representative Stubbs and I were there basically to facilitate the conversation between people in the faith community and activists and law enforcement. And to their credit, everybody came to the table with an open mind and a willing heart and the intentions to get something done.
As we all know, these can be challenging and difficult conversations. And Representative Stubbs, give me a sense, as someone who was helping facilitate, how real did it get in those rooms where you had the discussions?
Absolutely. And I think Representative Steineke captured it very well, the makeup of the task force itself, me being the Democrat, taking a risk to even come into this space, but being assured we would be in that space to merely focus on legislation and not focus on our political parties or persuasion, but to be authentic. I also think it's important to capture what happened in 7 months. The first thing is when we were created, this work group, our group was working during the time that there was the verdict with the Jacob Blake case. We continue to work during the umbrella of the verdict for Breonna Taylor case. And we also concluded our work 1 hour before the verdict in the George Floyd case. So it was very stressful. There were highs, there were lows. People were passionate. And we created the space for that to happen. We made sure when we came to consensus that it was what people really felt in that room. We tried to capture where members were going in conversation, what they agreed with, what they disagreed with. And I think when you read the report, you will see that captured. If a member really was not supportive of that particular recommendation, we made sure to capture that. But that space was a real space. We had members cry. We had members yell. We had members talk about their own personal experience and were victims. I was a victim of profiling. You had my case. In that space, we brought in 12 families across the state of Wisconsin who have lost loved ones with police brutality. So that day was an extremely emotional day. So what you're getting is an authentic process, and you're getting where people really landed in reality. And I wanted you to understand what was taking place around us with multiple unrest, but we were still able to stay focused in that room.
Representative Steineke, you know, when we have these conversations, as difficult as they may be, we learn from them. And I'm wondering, just on a personal standpoint, what did you learn sitting in on those conversations personally?
Yeah, I mean, Mike, it was tough as Representative Stubbs laid out. Some of these conversations were extremely personal and emotional. And you know, as a white guy living in Wisconsin, I didn't truly have a good understanding of the perspective of coming from a community of color in Milwaukee or Madison or Wausau or Green Bay. And I have to tell you, I learned a lot just listening to the stories and listening to the perspective. I don't necessarily find myself in 100% agreement with everything that was said in the room, whether it was coming from community members or law enforcement. But I think the important thing about this process was that it truly brought people together in an arena where we could have those honest, open discussions and do it in a way that was civil. Something that we're missing far too much in our political discourse these days, and something I hope that this process can show, that we can have these difficult conversations with people on different sides of an issue and still find a way to come together around consensus on how to move forward. That's my greatest hope out of this. Not only that we improve the lives of people in communities of color throughout the state, but also that we improve our political discourse, and maybe we can change how we operate. And maybe this is a process that we can use to tackle the big issues, because I'm afraid that people have lost their faith in government leaders, both in Madison and in Washington, D.C., and their abilities to come together to solve the big issues of the day.
Representative Stubbs, I'm curious. I asked Representative Steineke kind of a personal question, and I'll ask the same one of you, a slightly different question, though. And I was struck by something you said at the beginning, that some people were skeptical of what this task force would achieve. Was it just sort of a pretty picture that, oh, look, they're paying attention to that? Would there be real meat to it? And so I'm curious, from your standpoint, did people say to you, oh, why are you a part of that? You're just not, they're using you to be part of this conversation. Did you have any of those discussions?
Michael, it sounds like you were in the room.
Sadly, yeah.
But the reality is, yes. You know, one of the comments that I can just say to start off with is, Representative Steineke and I have always been friends. I've always been friendly to him. He's always been friendly to me. So it was an easy yes to him, but I'm also a woman of prayer. So when I was asked, I said, let me go and pray about this because I knew this task could change my life drastically, my political career drastically if things went wrong. So I knew it was a risk, but I was willing to take that risk for my community. I knew that Representative Steineke and I, we could work together. And I think that was critical and important for me. I'm very thankful that Speaker Boss gave me this chance. I'm really grateful that it started with Governor Evers with these 9 common sense bills and the Wisconsin Legislative Black Caucus talking about let's really make sure that we're moving policy on criminal justice reform. But when I walked in that space, I didn't always feel like I had the support that I thought I would initially have. But like anything that's new, you just got to work the process till you find out where you're able to level off and figure out where we find those agreements. And so Representative Steineke and I spent a significant amount of time saying, what do you think? What do you think? How should we navigate this conversation? What are you hearing from community leaders? And I would say, what are you hearing from the law enforcement members? But it was important for us to keep our line of communication open. We were effective leaders. We listened well. The only thing that I think we could have done better was change the name from task force. And the reason I say that is because I think a process has been established in the Capitol and people expected us to work that same exact process with the task force. But we had community leaders in that room with 2 elected officials. And so a part of what I was getting feedback from some of my colleagues was, oh, previous task force didn't do this or recommendations went there. But what we did was did something unique. We created something different. And I think that was one of the issues that I certainly battled with is people saw it as it's just another task force. But it literally was not just another task force. It was a meaningful opportunity to engage law enforcement, community leaders to start building trust. And the room was open to whomsoever chose to be a part of that dialogue. At the end of the day, I'll tell you what I said to Representative Steineke. I don't want to fail. This was important for me to make sure we stayed the course. We came out with recommendations. We're getting them into committee, and let's try to get them into law. Now, let's be clear. Representative Steineke and I are not the governor. That will be up to Governor Evers. But we will do all we can do to get the support of both sides of the aisle to make sure we have bipartisan support, because these bills, I truly believe, is the next level for criminal justice reform across the state of Wisconsin.
So let's get to that, Representative Steineke. Will all of these recommendations end up in the form of legislation? Will some of them end up in the form of legislation? They're already kind of in that process to begin with. So give us a sense of how much of what your task force recommended will actually have a chance of becoming law.
I think all of it has a good opportunity to become law. So that the recommendations fall into a couple of different buckets. The first one would be legislation that was already introduced, and our task force kind of recommended the legislation that was introduced, or at least the concept of that legislation. Then the next bucket would be legislation that was already out there, but our task force recommended changes, so amendments to that legislation. And then the third bucket would be the new legislation. So we're kind of working through that process currently. I'm really thankful to our friends in the Senate who have taken a couple of the amendments that we've already recommended and added them to their legislation. That's a really positive step forward. And then on the legislation that's new, I'm incredibly optimistic about the chances there as well, because now we have Senate leads on all of those bills as well, which is a really important step because the senators weren't involved in this task force. So my main concern throughout this whole process was that we were able to get buy-in from senators, even though they weren't part of that process. And by and large, that's really working well. But I did want to address something that you asked earlier, Mike,
Sure.
about the skepticism some had coming into the room. How can we blame people coming from communities of color to have skepticism over whether something or not was going to be accomplished or not? I mean, they've seen decades of inaction by both Democrats and Republicans at both the local and state levels. We have the worst achievement gap in the country. We've had that for decades and nothing has changed. So that's why this process is so important, that we can prove that Democrats and Republicans can come together with experts in all different kinds of areas to really improve the lives of people and communities of color throughout the state.
Very briefly, same question to each of you, Representative Stubbs and Representative Steineke. What was the reaction you got when, in the last month, since you released the recommendations, since the work of the task force was completed and made public? What did you hear from fellow lawmakers, from constituents, from those you just simply know? What was it, Representative Stubbs?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I heard some of my colleagues say, great job. Like, they were really shocked that we were able to work together for 7 months and have 18 recommendations. That was huge. I also heard people say, okay, now you got the recommendation, where are the bills? And I mean, hats off, and I don't have a hat on, but hats off to my colleague, Representative Steineke, who did an awesome job of assuring that the bills were assigned to committee. Getting Senate leads was just huge, that both of us took that risk when we didn't have a senator serving, but it was so important to make sure we went to the next step. So community has been always very vocal about what's next. What's next? Was this a dog and pony show? What are you going to get done? And so assuring them that we had no other agendas. And I had to make that very clear. And Representative Steineke too, we had no hidden agendas, but we wanted them to be honest with us and make recommendations that they really wanted to support as it goes through the process. And I think these 18 recommendations does exactly that. I think getting the bills actually introduced was huge. And now people said, you guys are moving very fast. Yes, we are moving fast. Media at some point has criticized us about why is it taking so long? It took so long because we took our time and we listened. And I think in government, we miss it oftentimes because we have our own timetable. But when you're working with community to get them to understand the process and get them educated in the process, or bring their knowledge in the room with law enforcement and try and come to a consensus, takes time. And because we took our time, we have 18 wonderful recommendations that I truly believe should be law.
Assembly Majority Leader Steineke, and I call you that intentionally because I want to narrow the question here a little bit. The reaction of your Republican colleagues, do they like what's being proposed? Are they a bit hesitant about some of the things that are being proposed? How would you describe their reaction?
No, I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. I think the challenge going into this room was in just the political dynamics, or that you're going to need both Democrats and Republicans. You're going to need community members and law enforcement. And ultimately, you're going to need the governor all to be on the same side of this. This shouldn't be a red or blue issue. This is an issue, again, like I said earlier, where Republicans and Democrats over decades have failed our communities of color in the state, have not done anything of note to really improve their situation and improve their children's lives going forward. So I just felt an incredible weight during this whole process. But I will tell you, as Representative Stubbs said, there was no way we were going to fail in this process. Representative Stubbs is a force of nature, and the last thing I was going to do is cross her in this process. She is somebody that I put all of my trust in during this creation of the task force and during the last 7 months. And I think that's that trust and that faith is being rewarded in the work that's been done, because it was never about her. It was never about me. It was about the people in that room and making sure that we did our best as legislators to help bridge that gap between the two sides and get something a note done. And that's why I have to applaud everybody that was part of this, both law enforcement and people from our communities, because they all came together wanting to get something done. And I think we ended up in a pretty good place. It's not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning, but it set up a structure of that hopefully people can trust going forward.
Let's spend a couple of minutes on some of the key recommendations. And I'm wondering if both of you feel this way about one of the recommendations in particular. And this is the one that basically says law enforcement officers will be required and can be punished if they do not report the use of excessive force by another officer, if they fail to intervene, if they fail to report it immediately. This seems like one of the bigger pieces of the legislation. Representative Stubbs, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that the other part of the space that was created for this task force is to make sure that community was heard in the process and recommendations came right from them that law enforcement agreed. I think it was important for law enforcement, for a community to hear law enforcement. So you'll see within our recommendations that there was some give and take on both ends, because when you give people an opportunity to sit down and understand systems, then we know how to create policy. So you'll see that. I think number two, something I want to go back and say, knowing Wisconsin has the worst disparities, it's the worst place to raise a Black family. For community that was in that room, which was basically all people of color that came into that space, it was important for us to take this personal. Like, I'm an African-American mom, a pastor, a legislator. I've been profiled. It was personal for me that I need to get this right for my daughter, for the next child, for the next family. So when you saw community leaders come in that space, we came in representing communities of color. And I think Representative Steineke saw that, law enforcement saw that, and they needed to hear that so they could hear the passion. And so when you look at some of these recommendations, it was important, especially during the fact of watching Mr. Floyd killed in front of our eyes on TV. And I think it was an awakening moment across the globe. And so he was really a sacrifice for justice. God bless his family. So I think you saw community leaders doing the unrest, find the no chokeholds, find the no knock warrants, find different parts of the policy more personable than I think others. But it was important for law enforcement to hear us and to work with community. And I think that was captured in these recommendations.
Representative Steineke, another recommendation is for the use of body cams for officers. And as we know, some departments use body cams. Some probably would tell you they don't have the financial resources to purchase body cams, to use them. Will this be something that you would like to see written into the law? And then B, how do you fund it? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. It's one of the conversations that we had often during this task force, because when you're dealing with a large number of community members and just a couple of legislators, the financial implications of things that we're doing, we just had to be very clear with our task force members that there were limits, that the more that we tried to mandate on local units of government, police departments, and cities and villages and towns, the less likely it was that something was going to be able to get past both houses and on to the governor. But body cams is something that both community members and law enforcement really desperately want. It just does boil down to the finances of it. It's not the purchasing of the body cameras themselves that's expensive. It's really the data storage that is. So that's why we're trying to come up with a grant program that will help departments get those systems up and off the ground and up and running, because everybody really agreed on that. That was one of those issues where we didn't really have any dissent at all. Everybody agreed that for transparency and accountability, body cameras were the right way to go.
You do have
the only thing I would
go ahead,
add
please.
to that, Michael,
Yeah, please.
that Representative Steineke said that's important is when we brought in victims into the room, they really talked about the importance of having these body cameras and being able to have the access to the footage of what happened, because in those last couple of minutes, being able to see what was happening with their loved ones. So I think that this particular piece of recommendation was critical. As Representative Steineke said, everyone was for it, including those families that lost loved ones. I just wanted to take a moment just to reiterate that I think sometimes when we're writing policies or looking at recommendations, we forget victims. But this was a win for victims.
You know, you mentioned, and I think it was Representative Steineke, you just mentioned that, you know, there was consensus immediately on certain things, but probably it did not come so easily on other items. And I want to talk to both of you about a couple of recommendations in here. One is a statewide prohibition on the use of chokeholds, except in life-threatening situations or in self-defense. I can speak personally here in Milwaukee. That's a really hot button issue for people. There are people in the community who feel that if you say that it's in self-defense, that's a fairly broad term. And does that mean that the chokehold is really prohibited or it's not prohibited? There is that question about it. Describe, I'll have each of you kind of give your perspective on this, why you think this was the recommendation that had to come forth, and say maybe some of the different opinions about that recommendation. I'll begin with Representative Steineke, and then we'll go to Representative Stubbs.
Yeah, so this is where I was really impressed by members of the task force, because everybody kind of came into the room when we were about to discuss certain topics, and everybody had their preconceived notions about what they wanted the outcome to be. But after listening to each other and having a good dialogue and hearing different perspectives, people walked out of the room with different opinions. And this is one of those areas on chokeholds where let's be clear, no law enforcement agency that we were able to find in the state teaches or trains chokeholds at all. Most of them in their policy manuals, we believe that most of them don't allow for chokeholds to be used. But when you're dealing with a situation where it's a life and death struggle, if an officer, their own life is in jeopardy or the lives of some other members of the community are in jeopardy, it was one of those situations where we came to consensus around keeping that exception in place, because the alternative is more deadly force, is reaching for that weapon and going to the gun instead of trying to subdue somebody through a chokehold. It's not ideal. It's not something any law enforcement officer wants to utilize, but I think they'd rather utilize the chokehold, much less lethal form of restraint, than going straight to their weapon. So that's where minds were changed on the task force, and that's how we got to that particular place on the chokehold ban.
I am guessing there are people in your caucus who could not support something that just did a complete ban on chokeholds. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be difficult, because again, the downside of that is could result in more danger to people in the community and people that the law enforcement is trying to apprehend than less danger. So it's really about, this whole process is about listening and learning from each other. And believe me, there were plenty of other instances where I came into the room thinking I was going to be, over on one side and got moved towards the other because of the conversations.
Representative Stubbs, I'll have you weigh in on this this question about a prohibition on the use of chokeholds.
Yeah, so I think Representative Steineke did a wonderful job of capturing what happened. Also, we were talking about the no chokeholds during the framework and during the frame time that we were having the George Floyd case. So I think you saw emotions going up and down, but I think, again, we were able to sit down and listen. And, I would say firsthand, when I initially came in that room and even wrote legislation to be a part of total prohibition of the chokehold, I myself moved to the middle because I listened to law enforcement. And when they said, if you take one more tool away from us, from our toolbox, then you're only going to leave us with a gun. And that is not the direction that I want to put community in, and that's not the direction I want law enforcement. So I wanted to focus more on de-escalation. So I think that what you hear in that room was, we know firsthand we don't want to see more people killed in the community. We know that a chokehold is not trained, right? Because it's use of force, deadly use of force. But it's most important that we listen and say, if there's going to be an exemption, here's where we want it to do, to include restraints to stop the blood flow circulation to the brain. I think our recommendation, meaning the task force recommendation that says chokeholds should only be used in life or death situations, is the right recommendation. And that's the recommendation that I am, really, really going to advocate for when it comes to our caucus.
Another recommendation deals with the collecting of data on the use of no-knock warrants, and the use of no-knock warrants again is sort of a major issue for some folks, and this seems like again sort of a first step, that you don't want to have a ban on no-knock warrants until you really could take a hard look at the data. Representative Stubbs, would that be the way of putting it? You need to see the data before you would act on a ban?
Absolutely. This is one of the discussions that I think went even in more detail. In fact, we invited Tamika Mallory, who's a national activist who has gone across the country advocating for the Breonna Taylor law, who gave us information. But I think it was important to ultimately know who is using the no-knock warrants, who's it used for, and why is it being used? So if you don't collect the data, how can you measure something that you never collect? So you can't manage something you've never measured. So it's important to get the information and show how it impacts across the state of Wisconsin, how these no-knock warrants have been disproportionately used against people of color, what kinds of crimes are the warrants being used for, who are they being addressed to, and what's the blanket of knowledge around producing the no-knock warrant. So this one, I think, is the exact right recommendation to start with data collection. We can't talk about it's an issue if we don't have the information. So this is one that I know all of the task force members were certainly in alignment with, in agreement with, that we need to start collecting the data.
Representative Steineke, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, this is, again, a remarkable point in our political discourse these days, when we're making decisions not to do something because we don't have the information. I think that's a huge positive for people to understand, is that we weren't just out there willy-nilly making these decisions because of political pressure on one side or the other. And that's, again, another reason I'm proud of the members of the task force, because they came together. They realized that they didn't have enough information to make a decision. So we found a way to get the information so that at some point in the future, decisions can be made on the necessity of no-knock warrants.
I want to move into something that's not directly the work of the task force, but it's all part of this discussion, and it's this. Do you worry? Do the two of you worry? You've just been describing a process that is clear, that both of you are proud of, that you feel was honorable, that was governed by integrity. Are you worried, though, that things can still get politicized as you try to work through this police reform legislation? There are a couple of pieces of legislation. There's one, I think, was a public hearing Tuesday afternoon, talking about reducing shared revenue for cities or municipalities that reduce essentially their training, retention, police budgets. If you reduce your police budget, we're going to reduce your shared revenue. Does that sound, to some people, I'm sure there are some people, Democrats in particular, going to say, boy, that sounds awfully political. That's punishment. I guess my question is, are you worried that that could detract from the bipartisan nature of the work that you've done? Representative Steineke?
I don't think so. I think we have to focus on the work we did, bringing people together to talk about these issues and finding consensus on some really difficult subject matters. that's what I'm going to choose to focus on. That's one of the things that we talked about with the task force early on, is that, we all have to do a better job of, instead of focusing on things that we didn't get or focusing on perceived wrongs in a process, we have to focus on where we have to celebrate where we were able to come together, celebrate things that unify us instead of focusing on those that divide us. And, I think by and large, that's what all of the members of the task force were able to do throughout this whole thing is, when we saw a roadblock, when we saw we weren't going to make progress on a particular issue or a particular way of addressing that issue, we found other things to get around that and still get at the heart of the issue that people were concerned about. So I'm going to choose to focus on those areas of agreement, and others, I'm sure, will focus, outside of this process, will focus on trying to tear, and pick this process apart. But I feel confident with Representative Stubbs at my side that ultimately we're going to stay focused and get the job done.
Representative Stubbs, I'll ask you to respond to that legislation, because you represent parts of Madison, and Madison may have its own idea, and Milwaukee may have its own idea about what police reform looks like and the money that you spend on police reform. What do you think of the legislation that would reduce shared revenue to a place like Madison?
Right. So, one of the things that I promised myself to do is stay focused and control what I can. So my focus literally has been on the task force. I mean, there are 99 state reps, there are 33 senators. Everyone's introducing their own thing. We have a budget before us. So I'm literally so focused on trying to make sure we answer all the questions that come out about our 18 recommendations. I think it's important also to realize there's always been a conversation about local control, right? And I know that takes it down a party line, but I don't want to be distracted. We, myself and Representative Steineke, promised that room that we're going to do everything we can do as legislators to get the bills out and to make sure we represented the task force in the best of our ability. Our work isn't done. We are just now starting to reach committee level. That is one of the most critical levels in this process. I literally want to stay focused there. I think there's the conversation that will divide us politically. But where we found unification, let's continue to move in that direction.
I appreciate both of you are very focused on this, and of course, my job is sometimes to ask what I think are the questions of the day, and the one other question I'll ask this of you, Representative Steineke, because you are the Assembly Majority Leader, the changes to the Madison and Milwaukee Fire Police Commission that have been proposed. Mayor Barrett was on my old TV show over the weekend, talking to Matt Smith, and he said, this should be a local control. You shouldn't tell us how many people to put on the commission. You shouldn't tell us that they have to be a member of the firefighters union or the police union. This is local control. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I understand. I completely understand that argument, and it's something that it coming from local government. I was a town chairman. I was on the county board. I tend to prefer local control over state mandates. I think when one of the tempting things as a state legislator is to try to go out and fix every single issue that's out there. And sometimes the answer is, you got to let the local units of government run their local unit of government. And if they do things that we perceive are in error or things aren't set up correctly, sometimes the answer is, for those people back in those municipalities, they had to talk to their locally elected officials instead of coming to the state looking for changes. So I can understand where the legislation is coming from. I know there's frustrations out there. I just tend to be more on the side of local control in issues like this.
My final question, and again for each of you, and I'll begin.
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure, please.
Michael. Yeah. So I could share with you that you'll find that myself and Representative Steineke understand local, because we both have served in county board, and I'm still at county board, and I support local control. I truly believe elected officials there have their constituency and they need to have a voice. And so I am very supportive of making sure local government have their voices. And then when we feel like they need a voice at the state level, it's called Wisconsin Counties Association that's available, that reaches out. And sometimes we'll agree with their recommendation and sometimes we don't. I've served on the board of directors. I've chaired a committee for WCA, but I think that's when we find those opportunities for their voices. So I truly believe it should be at local level. And I don't think that at the state level, we have to have our hands on everything because they have their own elected officials. So I just wanted to make sure I put a plug in on that. And I'm glad that Mayor Barrett is taking the time to really get out there with this issue and talk about it.
So I'll end with this, and each maybe take 20 seconds or so. What is crucial at this moment? You both expressed a great deal of optimism at the beginning of this conversation that there would be significant change to policing in Wisconsin based on the work of the task force. What's key to actually seeing that across the finish line, Representative Stubbs?
Yeah, I think what's key for me is watching these bills go through the process at committee level, hopefully getting these bills past that committee level, having the bills be exact from committee level and be placed in the chambers so all 99 state reps can vote and all 33 senators, and getting these bills to the governor's office and hopefully getting this done by June. We really need to have a hardcore deadline trying to get these bills out. We told community their work would not be done in vain. We told community, this isn't going to be political posturing. We told community that we would be the voice and that we would make sure they would be a part of the continued process. So for me, my work isn't done until these bills are signed into law, which means I have to spend time talking to Democrats who might be skeptical, talking to the governor's office, also keeping a line of communication open with Representative Steineke, talking to media. I think making sure people know that hopefully with this moment of time, and this is simply a moment of time with criminal justice reform, we want to make sure that the state of Wisconsin is on the record, that we have looked at reforms and these 18 recommendations definitely need to become law.
Representative Steineke, does June sound like a reasonable time to have a lot of this passed?
Yeah, that's when we plan on bringing all these items to the floor, is in the month of June, hopefully wrapping up before we pass the budget. But I just want to end by saying that we are really fortunate in this state to have incredibly good law enforcement that is often looked at nationally as a leader in their standards, their training, their practices, and they continue to do that work moving forward. They came to the table with an open mind, willing to make changes, and community came together willing to work with law enforcement to make those changes and listen to each other. And I'm just, again, really proud of the work that everybody did around the table, really proud of my co-chair and Representative Stubbs. And it's going to be a great day when we can get this to the floor and get good bipartisan support in both houses and send it on to the governor.
I just want to thank the both of you for this conversation. I think it's a really good conversation. The thing that struck me several weeks ago when we had the Milwaukee police chief and the sheriff and members of the community, Nate Hamilton, the brother of Dontre Hamilton, Kim Motley, who's defending some families in their disputes with law enforcement, Josh Call, the attorney general. We brought them all together. And the thing that struck me was that there was common ground there. And so what I hear you talking about today also is encouraging. And I wish you both the best of luck in seeing this to the end. So Representative Jim Steineke, the Assembly Majority Leader from Kaukauna in the Fox Valley, not to be confused with Kimberly, where my wife is from. Kimberly.
Oh, Kimberly, Mike.
No. Kimberly is, that's what I'm told. That's what I'm told.
That's outside of my district. It's a rival of my hometown Kaukauna team. So,
and Representative Stubbs, it's a pleasure to have you with us too. We thank you so much for your remarks today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks to everybody for watching today, and we'll see you next time right here on The Issues.